Hey guys, EvanNova95 here, and welcome to another installment of Versus Series Q&A, where I answer your questions and criticisms relating to the latest episodes of the Star Wars Versus series. Today we will discuss your thoughts on Season 7, Episode 11, Mara Jade Skywalker versus Cade Skywalker. However, before we jump into hyperspace, I want to just take a moment to give my usual thanks for the overwhelmingly positive feedback you guys have provided regarding the matchup. I really wanted to make this one as epic as possible, and genuinely push the bounds of what could be done with the format of blending combative evaluation with storytelling. I also wanted to change up the editing to make it feel more cinematic while still keeping to my usual design. Additionally, I wanted to have specific beats match the flair and context of what was being discussed without appearing too cheesy. Not that Star Wars isn't ever cheesy, but there is a fine line. The inclusion of my friend Deborah and myself as the voices of Mara and Cade for various segments was something I was thrilled turned out the way it did, since it easily could have come off as overbearing without the proper structure. Deb's a joy to work with, her energy is always bright, and her abilities vocally are frankly incredible. Which makes sense considering she's been working in the audio industry for years. I'm definitely going to keep that style going in future videos. Now then, we have a handful of interesting questions to get through, so let's not waste any more time. Here are my responses to you on the epic of Mara Jade Skywalker versus Cade Skywalker. Our first few questions come from Broken Knight, and they ask, would you be inclined to use Dassan or Darth Maul in an upcoming Versus? If Maul and Dassan fought at their peaks without the aid of the Valley for Dassan, who would win? Yeah, I'd be totally down to bring back Maul and introduce Dassan into the series at some point. It just depends on when and how the inspiration strikes me. Given that Maul appears prominently in both the old EU and Disney canon continuities, constructing a coherent evaluation of his abilities is a bit tricky. Still, at the same time, it does give us a larger pool to draw from in regards to specific timelines. There was a brief moment where I was considering pursuing a Darth Maul versus Corran Horn matchup, but I feel there's better for both of them out there. Dassan is a character I've been interested in exploring for years, as despite being the main antagonist of one of the most popular Star Wars video games in history, there doesn't seem to be much consensus in the Versus community as to where he ranks. Some consider him a threat surpassing Vader, while others write him off without a second glance. It would be nice to give him some spotlight and clear up his various combative misconceptions. Again, it's just a matter of finding the right opponent. Dassan versus Jarek? Dassan versus Malgus? Dassan versus Ventress? Do any of those sound good? As for Maul versus Dassan, I would say that pre-Valley Amp Dassan would likely lose to Maul, and post-Valley Amp Dassan would stand a solid chance of winning against Maul. While I would argue that Maul has superior martial skill, if post-Valley Amp Dassan is powerful enough to even somewhat press Jedi Academy-era Luke Skywalker, and mind you, this is without considering the unknown amount of power he siphoned from Yavin 4 later on, Maul is not going to be a completely insurmountable obstacle, that's for damn sure. Moving on to Knight's second question, they ask, what made you choose Cade and Mara for a Versus? Like the majority of matches this season, my initial reasoning for pitting Mara against Cade was rooted in a desire for character reevaluation and congruent thematic portrayal. I haven't featured Mara in a Versus match in 7 years, and I haven't featured Cade in 8. I literally recorded that Ulic Keldroma match when I was a senior in high school. Needless to say, my analytical writing and editing capabilities have evolved a bit since then. As such, the idea of refining my old breakdowns and examining these characters again with a more mature perspective was very appealing. Getting a bit deeper, there are the matters of portrayal and narrative overtones. Not only do Mara and Cade have a direct interaction that centers around their respective development, but the two share many similarities in both story and characterization. Both are immensely powerful Skywalkers with abilities unique even among the Jedi. Both are hotheads who present as uncaring, yet in truth would do anything to protect those they love. and both struggled with matters of personal identity fostered by their inner conflicts between the light and dark sides of the Force, before ultimately deciding to be their own people fighting on the side of good. Taking all those factors into account, the match seemed like one with a ton of potential for interesting discussion. Shifting into Knight's third question, they ask, would you want to use Cade again in the future, and if so, who against? I wouldn't be opposed to using Cade Skywalker again. His breakdown was genuinely a lot of fun to put together. As for who I would pit him against next, well, if we're staying with this theme of the Crusader fighting past members of his clan whose ghosts he's encountered, I guess Darth Vader would be the next logical choice? I mean, we've done Mara, and Cade fought Luke later in the series, so there really isn't anyone else to choose from in that respect. Could be interesting. Moving into Knight's last question, we have, how would a match between Obi-Wan Kenobi versus Mara or Cade go? Off the top of my head, I would say that peak Obi-Wan Kenobi would win against peak Mara Jade Skywalker, albeit with extreme difficulty, and would lose to peak Cade Skywalker, but again only with an extreme level of difficulty on the Crusaders' part. Although I consider Obi-Wan and Mara roughly equivalent in raw Force power, Prime Kenobi has better physical stats than Jade, has equivalent or debatably superior feats, and his fighting techniques and tactics are decently well suited to counter hers. In terms of structure, the Surisu style is basically the anti-Ataru. Mara has been shown to be much more susceptible to frustration, and Kenobi has proven that he can deal with both assassin and brawler-style tactics from powerful foes on multiple occasions, Asajj Ventress being the most obvious example. Don't get me wrong, Mara would put the Negotiator through hell before it was finished. In fact, I would go as far as to say that she would be the most grueling opponent he ever faced, with the sole exception of Darth Vader. However, when all is said and done, I do think that Obi-Wan would be able to weather Jade's onslaught long enough to pinpoint her weaknesses and outmaneuver her, winning the contest by the slimmest of margins. Cade Skywalker has similar shortcomings to Mara both martially and mentally, but he doesn't have her strength issues or stamina issues, and his Force abilities give him a much greater advantage. Honestly, I think a fight between Cade Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi would play out very similarly to the one I described in the verdict of Cade v Mara, with the only real difference being that Kenobi would take a more defensive stance, thereby forcing Cade to work a lot harder to break him down. So yeah, my opinions could easily change if I ever decide to make those matches into full videos, but right now I say Obi-Wan Kenobi narrowly wins against Mara Jade Skywalker, and narrowly loses to Cade Skywalker. Our next set of questions come from Dariel's Designs, who asks, have you considered bringing more obscure characters into the Versus series, like Spymaster Thulm, Setharth, and some of Jarek's Dark Jedi followers? Yes and no. I can't say I've given a ton of thought to covering Jarek's Dark Jedi, especially since Connor seems to have that down pat, but I'm by no means unwilling. If an exciting match is suggested or comes to me, I'll do it. Thulm and Setharth, on the other hand, are characters I've ruminated on more than once, and do have some genuine interest in covering at some point. Next up, Dariel asks, if you were to put yourself in the Star Wars universe as a Force adept, how would you conduct yourself in a versus match, and which characters do you see yourself winning against? New Jedi Order style consular with a green lightsaber and a heavy clerical focus that takes bits and pieces from a wide assortment of Force lore. I would basically be a sort of hippy-dippy mixture of Vong-era Jacen Solo, Luke Skywalker, and Obi-Wan Kenobi, wherein I would mainly flow through the universe while still maintaining a solid moral foundation that works towards the light. My moveset would probably be somewhat similar to Swarm War-era Jacen following his galactic pilgrimage, as I would pick up a wide assortment of abilities throughout my travels. I'd have the standard physical augmentation, TK, and telepathy, of course, but I'd also mix in some illusions, weather manipulation, plant surge, Tutaminis, emerald-colored force lightning, and a few other things as well. Martially, I would have the 3 Rings of Defense, Form 3 and Form 5, with maybe a few lesser-known fighting styles thrown in there, again picked up from my journeys. With all that considered, I would likely be effective against foes like Lord Qasim, Darth Maul, or Sora Bulk, but would struggle with fighters like Ulic Qel-Droma, Mace Windu, and Jaina Solo Fell. Lastly, Dariel asks, do you want to buy some death sticks? Nah, I'll stick with herb, thank you. I mean, did you see the side effects I laid out in my video? Up next, we have the TNN Taro Nu Network, whose first question reads, what made you shift your opinions on Kade's quote-unquote cheaters win over Mara? The constructive criticisms from my old shitty Darth Vader vs. Darth Kade video were a big factor, as well as just a general reinterpretation of the material fostered by time and evaluation. While I maintain my opinion that Kade's killing of Mara was a quote-unquote cheater's win, in the sense that he did rely on underhanded tactics to secure his victory, I don't view it with nearly as much vitriol as I once did, since I've come to realize that Mara wasn't exactly fighting fairly the whole time herself, nor is deception a betrayal of Sith philosophy. Mara does whatever she needs to do to get the job done, regardless of whether or not it epitomizes the Jedi way. She knew she wasn't strong enough to beat Kade head-on, so she used the environment to her advantage and employed hit-and-run tactics to weaken the would-be Sith sufficiently for her to fight him. If she doesn't give a damn about fair play, why should Kade? Furthermore, as I also mentioned in the video, expecting a totally fair fight with the Sith is basically the equivalent of expecting a totally delightful date night with an Enzadi. It's not impossible, but it's really not something you should consistently anticipate. Sith are cheaters. That's what they do. Even the more quote-unquote honorable among them like Qasim, Malgus, and Lumaya aren't above cheating so long as it gets them the win. Not only that, but the nature in which Kade cheated doesn't invalidate his performance up to that point, since he could still slug it out with Mara for an extended period even after she injured him. Shifting into TNN's second question, we have, if Mara had shown Force Stun against a trained Force user, would that have changed the outcome in any way? In my opinion, not really. First, we would have to consider the strength of the hypothetical Force wielder Mara stunned relative to Cade, as that would, of course, serve to gauge her ability. I think we could all agree that if we saw her stun Yun, we wouldn't automatically assume she's guaranteed success in stunning Darth Vader. Secondly, while Cade has never been shown resisting the effects of the Force Stasis ability, I don't think it would be out of the realm of possibility for him to break out of the paralysis before Mara could capitalize due to his higher power level, i.e. Valentine Farfalla and Obelisk armored Darth Bane. Lastly, even if Cade couldn't override Mara's Force Stasis with sheer power alone, I believe the argument could also be made for the Crusader utilizing an internalized application of Dark Transfer on himself to dispel the energy Mara pumped into his nervous system, since both incorporate the principles of energy manipulation into their makeup, thereby nullifying the attack. Next, we have TNN's third question. In the future, what opponents would you put both Mara Jade and Cade Skywalker up against, respectively, in the future? I think Mara vs. Galen Merrick has a lot of potential to be a good video, since they have so many similarities thematically, and it would also allow me to bring Galen back after so many years. Mara vs. Tholm would be neat too, since you have the whole assassin versus spy dynamic going for it, but the issue is that he's just so much weaker than her that there's virtually no point. Don't get me wrong, I like Tholm, and I do believe he's a bit slept on in the Versus community, but even if you want to highball him and say he's equal to End of Clone Wars Quinlan Vos, which in my opinion is a big stretch, he's still not winning against Mara. For Cade, as I said earlier, I am rather intrigued about the idea of pitting him against Darth Vader in the future, so that's probably where I'll go unless something else strikes me. Lastly, TNN says, I don't think it's fair to extrapolate feats from a duel with a Force Ghost. For example, how do you know Luke put any actual effort when he was basically a Force god in that battle? How could you substantiate the idea that Cade's dream feats are at all relevant for his real-life feats? Very fair criticism. Scaling any feats involving Force Ghosts is always challenging, since their capabilities differ wildly depending on their respective makeup. For instance, we have Acolyte spirits who can do little more than haunt tombs, and then you have cases like Tenavishi Corrin who can basically do everything he could while he was alive, but while glowing. Even in cases where we have a more developed understanding of the Force Ghost's makeup, like with Obi-Wan, Yoda, and Anakin, what exactly they can and cannot do is vague at best. And this all goes back to the overarching issue of the Force Ghost state still having yet to be explained in its absolute entirety. That being said, it has been a fairly consistent element in the franchise that whatever feats of combat a Jedi attains in the ethereal realm can at least be attempted in the physical realm so long as there aren't certain conditions directly attributed to the experience. And that was where I was basing most of my analysis. I mean, we even see shades of this in Empire Strikes Back when Luke can strike the phantom image of Vader in the Dagobah cave, and later does so again to the genuine article on Bespin. The main point of my examination of Cade's fight with Ghost Luke, and I agree I could have explained this better, was that it wasn't so much impressive due to Luke's overwhelming power, but more so because of Cade's conduct and the narrative framing of the comic. Luke may not have been in any danger of being destroyed by Cade, but the fact that he was willing to humor him with a duel and didn't obliterate his descendant instantly does say a lot about the young man's potential, if nothing else. The difference between this fight and something similar, like, say, Jaden Korr versus Marka Ragnos, is that Ragnos was moving from the spirit realm to inhabit a living body that clearly limited him, whereas Cade was taken from his body into the dream realm where Luke wasn't limited in the slightest. Furthermore, we do know for a fact that Sith spirits are much more limited in what they can do compared to Jedi spirits. And as such, I don't think it's unreasonable to assume the gap in capability between a Jedi spirit and their living body would be different than a Sith's. Looking back, I should have placed a greater emphasis on the potential aspect of the Cade/Luke fight rather than the moveset aspect. Less, this is a great feat because of what he did in this specific moment, and more, this is a great feat because it implies a high degree of ability in other circumstances. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying we should always take Vision/Spirit fights at face value, because we definitely shouldn't. However, since there is nothing in the comic or any supplemental material to suggest that Cade's capabilities were either enhanced or diminished while in his dream, I think it's safe to assume that the authors intended the battle to be interpreted as presented. Cade's duel with Ghost Luke is notable to me not because he stood a chance of winning, but because he was capable of briefly fighting back, which is something I genuinely don't believe many other Jedi in the grand scheme of things could accomplish. Next up, we have Jedi Spartan 38, whose first question is, since you've been featuring Skywalkers prominently in recent videos, have you ever considered doing a video ranking each Force-sensitive Skywalker in Legends, essentially anyone directly related to Luke or Leia, by power, similar to your rankings of Jedi Battle Masters and Grandmasters a few years ago? Yeah, I've toyed around with that concept more than once. 100% down to do it at some point. Would you guys like me to make that my next ranking video? Spartan next asks, do you think Kira Holt from the Knight Errant series has enough sources to be used in a Versus video, and if so, who are some of the characters that could be considered for her to be pitted against? She has more than enough material to draw from to be featured in a match. As for opponents, I'm not too sure off the top of my head since it's been a little while since I've seriously explored her stories. I know Darsha Ascent has been requested to fight Kira more than once, but I'm up for anything as long as it fits well. Shifting into Spartan's third question, we have, has it ever been mentioned where Mara Jade was during the events of Dark Empire? Indeed, the video game Star Wars Jedi Knight Mysteries of the Sith takes place during the same year as the Dark Empire comics, so player watch that if you're curious. The graphics and gameplay are more than a bit dated, but the story and voice work are still solid. Fun fact, Mysteries of the Sith was one of the examples of Mara's voice I sent to Deb to help her get into character for the video. Lastly, Spartan inquires, what happened to the Star Wars discussions on Reddy's Analysis channel? We still plan to release Star Wars content. In fact, depending on when this video comes out, Callan may or may not have released our review of the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, which basically just served as an excuse for a collective rant about the franchise. We also intend to review the Old Republic Deceived novel by Paul S. Kemp, which we haven't recorded yet, but who knows, that could have changed by the time you're watching or listening to this. Moving on, we have Hassel Hoffman 123, whose first question is, Have you seen the Vader fan film by the YouTuber Star Wars Theory? If so, what are your thoughts? Yeah, I've seen it. As far as fan films go, I'd say it's one of the better ones in recent memory. The visuals are well done, the acting is serviceable, the fight choreography is very creative, some of the best I've seen in a fan film. The passion for the lore just oozes out of every scene, and I am genuinely curious to see where the storyline goes in the future. This bleeds nicely into Hoffman's next question, which is, would you be up for doing a versus match in collaboration with Star Wars Theory featuring Vader as one of the combatants? I mean, versus matches aren't really his primary thing, and I imagine he's fairly busy with Vader Episode 2 right now, but, always in motion is the future, as a wise green man once said. Fun fact number 2, I've never directly interacted with Star Wars Theory, but I did meet one of his artists at a small convention in my hometown a little over 3 years ago. And I'm not kidding, he actually gave me one of his prints for free. Super nice dude. I hope he's doing well. Hoffman concludes with a proposed matchup, Vader vs. Kyle Katarn. All I'll say to that is go check out Connor's 3-part video covering that match, as it is a delightful experience you will not regret. Our next question comes from Danielle Mullis, who asks, how come some characters like Leia, Saba Sabatine, or the more obscure prequel-era council and regular masters like Adi Gallia, Siri Tachi, Evan Peel, Ferris Olin, or Aegon Kolar have never been featured? Besides the lack of official pictures aside, of course. The simple answer is that I just haven't gotten around to them yet. That said, I have every intention of featuring Leia and Saba next season, and I have also toyed around with ideas for Adi Gallia, Aegon Kolar, and Evan Peel here and there. Can't say I have a ton of interest in covering Siri Tachi or Ferris Olin for a match at this moment, but who knows. Come to think of it, Siri would probably make for a good How Powerful Was video. Might have to file that one away for later. Our next set of questions come from Voice of the Emperor, and they ask, have you ever thought of comparing weapons from Legends? If you're referring to a video dedicated solely to exploring and comparing different types of weapons, I can't say I've really given too much thought to it, but now that you bring it up, there is some potential for a fun discussion in there. I'd have to get Connor in on that one for sure. Moving into the Voice's second question, we have, that said, if you had to choose a weapon to fight something big, would you pick the LS-150 Heavy ACP repeater from the Republic Commando game? Nah, I would just mind trick it and then walk away. If the big thing in question is mechanical, I'd EMP it. Much less hassle. Lastly, Voice of the Emperor asks, would you say Darth Nihilus is more like a malevolent force of nature akin to a drug addict? Yes, Darth Nihilus is the walking definition of a chaotically evil abomination that only exists to slate its never-ending hunger. There is zero doubt in my mind that if Nihilus had somehow won in KOTOR 2 and also managed to crush any opposing forces that could have threatened him, he would have just kept consuming the universe until he eventually just ate himself. Similarly to what happened with Ungoliant from the Lord of the Rings universe. Our final question comes from Falcon LT203, who asks, one of, in my opinion, underrated pieces of Legends continuity was Star Wars Battlefront Elite Squadron. While by no means perfect, and definitely one of the more interesting stories in Legends, but I really appreciate what it was able to do story-wise, particularly the DS version. My question is, what are your thoughts on the characters X1 and X2, and is there enough information to do a How Powerful Was episode on them? Brackets, I know I already asked this question in one of your community posts, but I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on the characters due to their ties to the NJO, assuming you've played it, of course. Well, my views on the characters of X1 and X2 are sadly limited since I've never actually played Star Wars Battlefront Elite Squadron. All I remember about that game are the few references given to X1 and 2 in the guidebooks, as well as that cool commercial they used to air that showed the stormtroopers getting bombarded from orbit. I remember being so shocked that land and space battles could finally be played simultaneously, and then my hopes were immediately thrown into the Rancor pit when it was revealed that the game would only be available on handheld consoles, none of which I had. Anyway, first world childhood problems aside, even if the X-clones only have a single game and a few guides worth of content going for them, I would still say that's enough grounds for a How Powerful Was video. One of the joys of doing these breakdowns is that it gives me the excuse to revisit content I've previously enjoyed and experience certain forms of content for the first time. If enough of you guys want the next How Powerful Was vid to cover X1 and X2, then I'm all for it. Just let me know. I'll never say no to a good story. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed this installment of Versus Series Q&A. I tried to stick to the more popular inquiries this time around, so I hope you found my answers both satisfactory and entertaining. As always, leave your thoughts or questions in the comments section below. May the Force be with you, stay safe, and I'll see you guys later.